Another cool thing to think about is John Conway's Game of Life. John Conway was my undergraduate thesis advisor. He passed away this April from COVID-19, but he did a lot of very cool math before he did that. The Game of Life is a zero-person game. It's really just a computer simulation. You can do it on paper too, but it's a little bit faster on computer. You've got an infinite grid, and you put a dot in some of the squares of the grid, and his game rules tell you where to put new dots and where to delete dots. So here are the rules for the Game of Life. Each cell represents a person, and if that person, so let's see, there's this person, there's a maximum of 8 neighbors. You can count the number of neighbors. If there's 0 to 1 neighbors around that person dies of solitude. So, if this person's alone, it's going to die of solitude. If the person has 4 or more neighbors, they're going to die from overcrowding. And then if there's 2 to 3 neighbors, that person survives. In addition to deaths, there can also be births. If an empty cell, I didn't put a B here. If an empty cell has exactly 3 neighbors, then there will be a birth. So for example, if we look at this one, actually this one, all 3 of these guys will survive. This guy has 2 neighbors, will survive. This guy has 2 neighbors, this guy has 2 neighbors. And this empty cell has exactly 3 neighbors, so there will be a birth. So that's how it works. Let's do some examples. Let's look at this row of 3 people. This guy has 1 neighbor, so he's going to die. This guy has 1 neighbor, so they will die. This one has 2 neighbors, so they will survive. And then there's these 2 empty cells that each have 3 neighbors, so there will be a birth there. So what happens? We lose the top and the bottom guy, we keep the middle guy, and then there's births next to him. So now we have a row of 3 people. Well, this situation should be symmetrical. If we do this again, these guys will die, this guy will survive, and there will be births there. So this will actually go back and forth. If you look up, there's lots of computer simulations of the Game of Life, and this will be more satisfying to watch than me drawing dots. You can watch this pattern oscillate back and forth. If we look over here at this pattern of 4 people, this is actually what we call a still life, meaning if we look at each of these guys, there's exactly 3 neighbors, so they will all survive. And then there's no empty cells with exactly 3 neighbors, so there's no births. So this thing actually just remains constant there forever. Let's do one more very cool example. So cool that it has a name. It's called the glider. So what happens with the glider? This guy has 1 neighbor, so they will die. This one will survive with 2 neighbors. This one will survive with 3 neighbors. This one dies of overcrowding. 1, 2, 3, 4 neighbors. And then this one will survive with 2 neighbors. And then let's see if there's any births. This square has 3 neighbors, so there will be a birth. And then this square has 3 neighbors, so there will be a birth. So that's the next phase of the glider. Let's keep going. What happens now? This one has 1 neighbor, so they will die from solitude. This one also dies from solitude. This one survives because there's 2 neighbors. This one has 2 neighbors, will survive. This one has 3 neighbors, will survive. And let's see if there's any births. This square had 3 neighbors, so there's a birth there. And then actually this square up here had 1, 2, 3 neighbors. 2 of them are dying, but there's a birth there. You're allowed to die and leave behind offspring. Okay, let's go back to the original color. Let's do this one more time. This one dies from solitude, only 1 neighbor. This one survives, 2 neighbors. This one has 1, 2, 3 neighbors, will survive. This one has 3 neighbors. This one has 2 neighbors, will survive. I think I did something wrong. No, this one has 1, 2, 3, 4 neighbors, so will die from overcrowding. Okay, but these 3 guys survive. And then, are there any births? Actually, this square, which is empty, will be filled, because there were 3 neighbors here, so this guy comes back from the dead, is replaced by a new person. And then anything else should be, oh, and then there's a birth here from these three. Okay, so now we've got this configuration. Let's do it again. This one that was just born dies from solitude. This one dies from solitude. And then this one survives. There's 3. This one has 2. Survives. This one has 1, 2, 3. Survives. And then there's a birth here from 3 neighbors. And then actually this square had 1, 2, 3 neighbors. So there's a birth here. And if you remember back, you can scroll back in the video if you need to. This is the exact same configuration that we started with, except it's shifted down one diagonally. So if you look up a glider on a Game of Life simulation, you'll see it move through those, I think there were 4 phases, and then come back to this, and it's shifted. And as time goes on, it will actually travel slowly or quickly, depending on how fast the simulation is, this way across this screen or the paper. That's why it's called a glider. There's a funny video of John Conway saying that he should not have called it a glider because it kind of looks like an ant, and he should have called it an ant. John Conway was very particular about the way he named things. Okay, so what does this have to do with Markov chains? Well, if there's 0 people, 0 filled cells, then nothing happens. So with probability 1, we still have 0 filled cells. If there's 1 filled cell, it's going to die. Doesn't matter where it is, it dies of solitude. Go back to 0 filled cells. If there's 2, also doesn't matter where they are. They each have at most 1 neighbor. So they're both going to die. And then let's think about 3. So it looks like we can stay at 3. So that's an option. We saw the case where there were these 3 guys, and then we added 1, so it looked like we could go to 4. And then also, if they're really far apart, then they could go to 0 as well. You could put 3 socially distanced dots. Can't see the 3rd dot. 3 socially distanced dots here. They will all die of solitude and go to 0. And it's a little bit harder to calculate these probabilities. You might have to ask what the constraints are. If we're allowed to be anywhere, then this situation is much more likely. So maybe there's some constraints, and you could calculate probabilities. And then we could think about what 4 does. Isn't going to be a simple Markov chain. This is an interesting phenomenon that's been well studied. Certainly cannot be fully studied with the tools in our course. But it's got some Markov chain-ish things and is interesting to think about.